Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I don't think there's that many hard and fast rules of space conferences, but one of them has got to be not following Clint Clark as a panel. But thankfully, I've got a brilliant bunch of panelists with me today. How to tackle the many threats in space, and we have 45 minutes. So I think we could easily fill this whole day talking about space security. But I really want to take this opportunity for this panel to talk about perhaps the less obvious threats in space, the everyday threats that we see, specifically in the electromagnetic spectrum, specifically also when it comes to cyber attacks. And I know there's a lot of industry in the room, and I would like to think that this audience is already well prepped and knows a lot about space security already. But I do think there's parts of industry that think, we're a civil corporation, we're not associated with the military, therefore we don't need to worry about space security. You may not be interested in space security, but I can assure you space security is going to be very interested in you. And I think we've seen over the last couple of years that really there's not one sort of part of space that can be completely safe from all threats. Let me quickly introduce the panel that I have with me today. On my left, we've got Andrea Adelsbach, who's the Chief Information Security Officer, SES and LuxGovSat. We've got Nick Saunders, who's the Chief Cybersecurity and Data Officer, Global and Space Networks at Viasat. We've got Pino, who is the head of Geo and Space Services for the 3 SAS program at SITCEN at NATO. And last but certainly not least, we've got Lieutenant Colonel James Tucker, US Air Force C4 Current Ops Branch at USEUCOM. Now, I want to start off with you, Andre. I think we all have sort of in the front of our minds the cyber attacks that we've seen in the context of Ukraine, and I think in general, I like to think we've become much more aware of them. How prevalent are cyber attacks on space services? But also, is industry actually waking up to that danger?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, industry is waking up. I think the attack against Viasat at the start of the Ukraine conflict was definitely the wake-up call. I think most of the big operators had in their risk registers that things like that can happen, right? But then seeing it happen definitely is making the difference, right? So what I can say is we see definitely an uptick in cyber threats targeting us in the whole industry. And that's basically underlining that we as a whole industry, all organizations have to do more in order to protect themselves and also the overall value chain, basically. So we have been updating and upgrading our cybersecurity strategy over the last years, and there are 2 key concepts in it. The first one is the zero trust concept, so that we basically design our systems under the assumption that components of the system have been breached, and so that the overall system still remains resilient, even in case of individual breaches. So I think this is really a fundamental mind shift. And this also requires specific capabilities by all the different system components involved. And that's really where we focus on the second strategy pillar, which is to leverage the ecosystem, because this is something that really requires new security capabilities across all systems that are involved in delivering the overall ComSat services. And this is something that has to be further developed together with the ecosystem and our partners.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned partners, because I think specifically when the Viasat attack happened in 2022, I think, my perspective as an outsider was that Viasat's sort of reaction to this was actually exemplary, in the sense that, you guys were really transparent, coming out to places like this to discuss what had happened and sharing information about how this can be prevented in the future. But Nick, we actually want to talk about RF with you. Now, attacks on the electromagnetic spectrum, I think, again, Ukraine has really highlighted the danger of that. We've seen continuous GPS jamming in Ukraine, obviously already since 2014 in the east of the country, but much more distinct now. How common has jamming actually become? Is this something that's, pun intended, flying under our radar a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. And first, thank you for moderating, and thank you for having me here to the GovSat team. It's my first time here. I'm very excited. But I think, just to put the RF attacks for a second into context, of course, everybody, I think, is pretty familiar with the attacks that happened on our KASAT network that was in February 24th, 2022. From that, there were actually 2 cyber attacks that occurred during that time frame concurrently, and they happened right within that same time frame of the physical invasion. But there was a wiper attack that occurred, which attacked terminals. There were also attacks from terminals. So, Andre, you mentioned zero trust. There's a clear example of a need for zero trust on terminals that may change hands and then go after someone that's on the network. So just to put that into context for a second, the adversary came with 2 plays that they were clearly prepared for. And then from there, we see adversaries really don't care about what domain they're working within. They have an objective. And so if you think about that objective, the RF, putting that attack into context, your question is, how often did that occur? RF attacks are going on contested areas for our networks on every single day. And so and these are regional-based interference attacks, and we deal with them. We've gotten quite good at categorizing data and understanding and how to detect these types of attacks and then ultimately respond. One of the things that we've had to do is invest in resiliency and how to deal with RF attacks. So they are ongoing, to answer your question, and so there's some things I can disclose and then some things that we will maybe hold back on, with the priority being those end users. So, yeah.
Absolutely, thank you very much. Lieutenant Colonel, in your experience of the day-to-day operational, how often is space security considered? Is it still a sort of fringe topic that you have to remind people about, or is it something that comes up naturally?
So what I like to say is, first of all, thanks for being here. Thanks for moderating. It's my first time here, and it's pretty big compared to the other conferences I've been to at SATCOM. But from a security perspective in space, right, it is becoming a lower bar to get in. So that concerns me a little bit, because while I'm a cyber warfare officer by trade, the folks that are now have access to SATCOM are your personnelists, your dentists, your doctors. I don't know if they're necessarily thinking of cybersecurity as being first, right? At least with the constellation like that you guys all operate, you're kind of thinking of cybersecurity, you're thinking about cyber protection, you're thinking about physical protection as well, but because of the access is lowered, I don't know if they're always thinking about that, and they're using it for official government business when they're using some of those other constellations that they were just to go to your local electronics store and purchase.
Thank you very much. Pino, we've got you here speaking also from the Strategic Space Situational Awareness System that NATO is building. And I think, especially in discussions about what Europe needs to do on space, I think space situational awareness, or rather the lack of it, sort of in European autonomy terms, I think comes up first quite often in these discussions. For those of us who are not perhaps as well versed into the system as others, could you give us a sort of brief outline about the program and perhaps also an update of where we are now?
Thank you, and thank you for moderating. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's my first time here as well, and I also find this event absolutely impressive within this contest. So I've attended, so my background is, I've been in NATO headquarters in Brussels for nearly 26 years, and most of my career has been within the geo expertise, but I find myself, ever since the leaders' meeting in London in 2019, they declared space as operational domain. I had this idea of investing some of the, to leverage some of the resources that we had at NATO headquarters to explore the possibility of building a system dedicated specifically to this domain. So, to put it in the right context, let me just say, one of my expertise at NATO headquarters was always to bridge the difference between our operational commands and the Council. So my responsibility is really to serve the Secretary General, the Chairman of the Military Committee, and the North Atlantic Council. And we're talking about ambassadors, we're talking about laypersons, but talk about people that actually take decisions, and they need to understand what the threat is and what level it is. And sometimes we have seen from the previous speaker, it was an impressive presentation, it really was alarming us. But then while I was sitting there, I was thinking, that's exactly what is my challenge every day at Brussels and at headquarters. Make sure that I can bridge that gap, make sure that what we have seen, we can present to the Council in a clear, plain English, in a way that the laypersons can understand it. So, and that's when 3SS came along. I named this program. Luxembourg came forward, thank you, and Luxembourg is, we know, very proactive in space. They saw my presentation at the Conference of National Armaments and decided to invest into this. The reason why I named it strategic is specifically want to make sure that the name itself of the program would just clearly identify the fact that it is designed to brief leadership in the headquarters and at the level of the headquarters. So we obviously have in our in Ramstein, in Germany, in ERCOM, we have our Space Operations Center. We have accredited recently through our Alliance Command Transformation in Norfolk, we have accredited the Center of Excellence in Toulouse in France. So with all that, just to make clear, NATO takes space very seriously. We are working very hard on all fronts. So what we are doing is we are entirely developing a building in-house, and we're developing this directly on our classified network so that we can combine it and basically fuse it with all possible sources, so the information, classified information as well. So that was our approach. So we're building this set of 6 applications, web-based, and developed directly on the classified network. So I just want to make a reference, and just to close the point, and we are interested, of course, in everything that happens up there in space. So that's why this program focuses purely about awareness in the space domain. I think there will be a colleague afterwards in another panel where we're going to hear more about the Alliance Persistent Surveillance from Space. That is more about using also space assets for space-based ISR. And my colleague Larissa will talk about that later on, hopefully a little bit later because of this disruption. But we are really interested in having a complete awareness of what happens in space. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to talk about resilience now, which is a bit of a joke after what just happened here. Andre, you already talked about the zero trust concept, which obviously is one of the ways in which we can sort of gain resiliency. Specifically with reference to cyber, currently it's kind of up to each company how they want to conduct their cybersecurity. Do we need almost like a legal framework, almost like a must-dos for companies in order to accomplish this?
Yeah, I think a legal framework has its benefits, but before I'm going to talk about the legal framework, I think we touched this morning on the ISAC concept, right? And so this is really something that we identified as being really important to us, and we joined Space ISAC, I think already 2019 as a founding member, and we supported the stand-up of the Space ISAC, and it's an international Space ISAC, right? So it really has a large international community as well, and sharing threat intelligence, but also information about vulnerabilities and establishing norms or best practices in order to build and design resilient systems is really a huge benefit, I think, for the whole ecosystem. Then talking about laws and regulations, so in the EU, we have the CER directive, we have the NIS2 directive, and also the upcoming space law, which are going to or which are covering already and regulating also the ground-based part of the SATCOM infrastructure, basically. And I think commercial companies don't like regulations, right? I would have to lie, but I think it also helps establishing a certain baseline hygiene, and also it helps pushing security requirements across the whole supply chain. So even if individual operators are, asking for certain security controls to be implemented in SATCOM equipment, it doesn't have the same weight as if, all satellite operators are asking for this, because they are required to do so, right? So I think it has, it will have benefits in making sure that that security capabilities are evolving across the whole supply chain.
Thank you for also stressing the supply chain element, because I think it's also something that gets lost in those conversations sometimes. Nick, pretty much the same question to you about how do we build resilience? Do we all just invest in optical comms now, or?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So I look at resilience as making sure that, ultimately one threat does not then cause the full impact, right? So in this scenario, maybe one wire is, one situation where, a speaker system can go down, right? Or in a satellite system, if one thing goes out, or another thing goes out, or another thing goes out, that's the failure case of resilience. The other version of that is, this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing all need to fail, right? This is defense in depth, of course, right? But I think one of the things that as we think about, frameworks, regulatory, are often for maybe designing resilience, but there's different ways to kind of impose, frameworks and regulations and cybersecurity controls. Some of those might be generic IT controls, right? And these are good, these are helpful, but we also need to leave room for design-based security or domain-based security. So you have to think about, okay, I'm designing a system with these doorknobs and these bells and whistles, right? So I have to think about now, okay, because I have a doorknob, I have to get creative about the solutions and maybe not trust just that doorknob, right? So as I think about the application of zero trust, you have to leave room in a regulatory type of a context to design for resiliency as well. And so I think there's a tension that must be traded between those two different, design-based as well as kind of general IT security controls.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that sort of dilemma that we have, especially when we talk about communication systems. You can't make them so resilient that you can't talk to them anymore, because then lose the point of having the asset in the first place.
Yeah. So you asked about optical. I'm sorry, I didn't answer that part of the question.
I mean, a question for people who want to invest. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good basket to put some eggs in. But I don't think, we should be designing fully to, all of the eggs in one single basket, right? So some of that might be supply chain diversity around optical. Sometimes that might be in a certain scenario. A pointed laser is impractical for some applications of communications. And so I think we have to think about where we're putting our eggs dependent on the scenario and context. But I do think, we're heavily investing in optical as well. And we believe that this will help quite a bit in resiliency for things like RF jamming and other things like that. So yes, and we should do other things.
No one-size-fits-all approach, certainly. James, I want to come back to you. I think we've seen a sort of evolution of the Space Force, of generally how the US sort of conducts space operations in the last couple of years. There was a Mitchell report for Institute that came out a couple of weeks ago, and it threw a couple of things out. And I think one thing that sort of stuck out to me, because it's something that I always assumed is true about European armed forces, but the report highlighted it about the US as well. It's sort of lack of education in the armed forces when it comes to space security and resilience, and it highlighted resilience as well. Is that something that you would sort of agree with, disagree with?
So to a point, yes, I do agree with it. I was just talking to my colleague, James DeBrock, who's over here, who's accompanied me from Stuttgart. And so I've been on both sides. I've been a user. I've also been a Schriever as a C2 guy, and then came back to be a user. And so one thing you'll find is, and to include our teleport sites, our users, our satellite controllers, and our teleport sites don't know kind of what each other does, right? And so therefore, I'm a user on the ground. Hey, why can't I use more power? Because I can't get to my distant end, or I can't get my information I'm looking for. Then you got the teleport site sense. I can give you no more power, but the C2 guy's got to tell me you can have more power, right? And so nobody really understands what the other ones are going on. And so one thing we're trying to do in UCOM is, with our teleport sites, trying to get Space Command to come over, with Space Force already at Ramstein, that we need to get in the room and talk. And so this past year in December, after like our 6-7 year hiatus, we had a USEUCOM SATCOM working group. And the big takeaway from that is, at a minimum, is people were communicating, didn't even know each other existed as an organization, more or less a person. And so to your point, yes, there is a lack of education, but we're trying to close that gap. Each organization know their piece of the pie, but they need to understand the greater good. Thanks. Thank
you. Pino, I want to come back to you, and I hope the system holds this time when we come back to you. I think 3SAS is, I think, one of the sort of flagship programs that we've seen NATO come up with for their space strategy as well. But I think in general, it perhaps highlights, some of the general conduct between, when it comes to the different space powers coming together. What are the obstacles, or what are some of the challenges in bringing together everyone around the table for, a topic so critical but also so complex, such as space situational awareness?
Yeah, that's a good question, tough question, but I would say in any program there are challenges, but in particular when developing a system that involves all the allies, in particular in this case 32 allies, our priority is always we need to make sure that we are interoperable, that we can communicate to each other, we can automatically ingest data coming from one nation, and whether that comes from their own national assets. So I would say within the space domain, that looks to be less of a challenge than it was before, also because we have learned from our lessons from the past, but does not pose a challenge. So in terms of still, I think your question is still related to 3SS, of course, when developing 3SS. So the data is another challenge, of course, because we have heard also today, since this morning, that there is the commercial sector that is running fast, and we need to work. So we need to partner with the commercial sector and work with them and make sure that we can put all the data together, whether it comes from the governments, some national data, or whether it comes from commercial partners. We have to make sure that we can absorb and process all that data together. So these are some of the challenges that I would identify. And another aspect is obviously what we have seen even earlier. We should think about, it happens in many other domains, maritime domain, air domain, but space domain is no different from other domain. We're talking about big data also in space. So every tick of the clock, every second, there's a massive amount of data that is generated there and that we need to process. So we should not exclude leveraging system that can help us, creating some kind of an alerting system, because we don't want to have an army of analysts to always be there. And that is one aspect. The other aspect is also the computational power that you need to make sure that you can process all the data you get from there. Thank you.
Thank you. I think collaboration in general is a really important point that I actually want to throw back at the whole panel, because you're much too valuable to be sitting here to not answer that question. And I think information sharing between states, I think even in alliances, has been very tricky, especially when it comes to space assets. I remember someone telling me there was difficulty sharing certain satellite images within NATO, not because the content of the images was classified, but because the asset that took the picture was classified. So it was like, you can't look at my resolution. I think, again, we have become better since Ukraine in particular. Obviously, the US has managed to sort of set up a channel that allowed commercial providers to channel their data straight to the Ukrainian armed forces. But yeah, I'm going to start with you, James. In terms of collaboration, specifically between different militaries, Have we got better? Yes, no? And how much do we have left to go?
So I wouldn't be a good Air Force officer if I didn't quote my general, General Cavoli, right? And so he's very much into collaboration with our allies and partners, and include NATO, right? And so he pushes that every single day he sees us. And so specifically inside of the SICS, we're currently trying to put systems on desks that were not there before to open up the aperture for collaborations with the allies and partners. And so, yes, we're pushing forward with it. There are things in the work that's going to require us to show that we're doing it. And so as we keep moving forward, as everybody said at this conferences, we're never going to go alone. We're going to have to go with our allies and partners, and we just need to make it stronger. But in order to make it stronger, we got to trust the communication, and we have to communicate, right, at all levels.
Thank you. And I think similar question goes for commercial as well, specifically as we're sort of seeking greater integration. Nick, perhaps you could start us off. How has collaboration with governments and militaries generally been for you? Do you think it's improving?
Yeah. I think it's improving. There are new things like EU Cyber Blueprint that are proposed. There's roadmaps on how kind of information travels within different organizations. US has done quite a bit in terms of information sharing channels, establishing those. But I kind of want to maybe put everybody, I appreciated, Clint, when you went into the mindset of making everybody uncomfortable in more ways than one. But I also think that, I want to maybe make everybody understand how it feels when you're going through a crisis. You don't have everything you need. You're going to wish you had more. One of the things a colleague of mine, Mark, said at Black Hat when we first kind of started our sharing campaign around this was, you cannot establish trust in a crisis. You're going to find that you wish you had more tools. And so you better pre-establish those. You better understand how information sharing will be exchanged, where it can go, where it shouldn't go, and ultimately what forums and venues you're going to want. So I'd say that's kind of maybe one way to look at it, but there are other tools you're going to want to establish. Sharing is one key, very important one, though, that you should establish up front.
Andre, do you have words of wisdom to add from your side?
So collaboration definitely in Luxembourg it's really easy to get in touch with the different state actors. In other countries, it's a little more involved, let's say, and a little more formal. But definitely, I see that states recognize that they also have a responsibility to help organizations, commercial organizations, through this, because actually, facing nation-state threat actors, I think it's something that no organization individually can tackle and cope with, right? So that's really why this concept of collective defense is so critical, and why nations or states have also to support the organizations, right? Because it's a partnership at the end of the day, and they also depend on our services, so they have a vital interest to support. And I think that's something I definitely see has been evolving very positively over the last years.
That's great to hear. We do have a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to check in the audience if we have questions from people. Bearing in mind, I'm slightly blinded, so if you have a question, please do put your hand up quite aggressively. No? We have lost critical mass after the incident, to be fair. But if there's no question, I'll give you another chance in a minute. But I just want to pick up on a point you just made about also how governments are now dependent on commercial to a great extent. And I think it actually brings us to the discussion of if a company is involved, specifically in a conflict setting, and they become target of an attack as a result of that involvement, what mechanisms are there to protect those companies, right? And I think the US has come out with 2 commercial strategies for space in the last couple of years. And actually reading through them, insurance is mentioned. But then when you sort of look into the annex, and if you read the fine print, it does also say there's no current actually established authority that would give insurance to those companies. So I think a question for all of you, and we're going to start with you, Andre. Do we think that's something that needs to be sort of factored in already? Is that something we need to talk about? Is that something we need to set up? Because at the end of the day, I think we could also argue a company is not safe by virtue of not actually having government as a customer. You know, a threat actor could look at a service and say, that in theory is, you know, valuable enough to attack them with or without a government contract. So insurance for space companies, who's liable, who should pay, what should we set up?
Well, I'm not really referring to an insurance, right? But it's more, and it's something that is part of, or probably is at the root of NIS2 and the CER directive, right? The understanding that the different member states are heavily relying on certain critical infrastructure domains and service providers, and it's in their own interest to establish a framework that allows them to protect them, right, and to also then indirectly protect their citizens. So I think from that perspective, I think this has been identified and it has been addressed, and so from that perspective, I see regulations as something very positive and beneficial for all of us.
Well said. I think if you think about this from an economics perspective or kind of from a company perspective, there's kind of two major ways to think about risk. So if you start with just risk exists, someone can hold that risk. The company and the shareholders can hold that risk, or ultimately an insurer, an indemnifier, or some other party can hold that risk, or an owner of a government-owned system can hold that risk, right? But the two strategies are essentially price-based risk or indemnification or insurance. And then regulation kind of is the third, or maybe not regulation, but the act of securing in general, more generally, is a way to tie out or make those closer together. But companies are going to think about essentially what those risks are. So for companies, it's to all of our interests to then think about, how do we all understand that risk that we're carrying, and environmental risk, things like, am I in LEO and there's a bunch of satellites that face sustainability problems just as much as a cyber problem, right? So as you think about what those risks are, now companies will have to judge kind of generally what those risks will be for them, how much they're holding, how much they're liable for, and either put that exposure into a price to make that market useful, or turn that into something that's an insured strategy. And so there's kind of two different ways generally to be thinking about this, and companies will ultimately kind of respond. And it's to government to look to basically incentivize companies to be a part of that, to increase resiliency and diversity.
I would say, from a national perspective, if a number of companies are already strategically important for a country, from the defensive perspective as well, I mean, probably a number of companies, they already have some kind of, I'm not saying protection, but some kind of attention from that country, at national level, from that government. Obviously, we have been debating that in NATO, so I would be curious to see what will come at the next summit that we have in The Hague in June, whether something like that might make it or not for the head of states at The Hague, but we will see. But it's not something that we are not considering, of course, because we cannot imagine a day, even in our normal life, not in military operations or in operations, we cannot imagine a day without space. So every single minute of our lives is we are depending on space assets. I mean, as we grow, we become more dependent from the commercial sector. Obviously, we have been asking those questions ourselves. What do we do? So, but the approach has been what NATO nations are doing nationally first, because that is something that is already in place, and then we take that into the context of NATO. So that's what I can say at the moment, but I would be curious, if something perhaps along those lines would not appear at the next summit. I mean, there is nothing decided yet, but there are a lot of debates and discussion related to space domain, of course, that will make it to the summit. So.
From my standpoint, I think it's a very complex answer, and this is why: was it an accident? Was it on purpose? it's like the cyber world, right? There's always things happen in cyber. Is it on purpose? Did somebody not, they just leave their password on the table and somebody just checked it out, see what does it good? So that's why I think it's a complex answer that there would have to be a collaborative approach to determine what the response is. Is it nothing? Is it something? And then I think most companies like yourselves understand there's inherent risk with everything. There's inherent risk when you're dealing with the government, the military, all those things are into play. So to say if this happens to do this, I think it's at the moment unrealistic, but you never know. Like the future is unknown in a lot of ways. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Unless there's any burning questions from the audience. Oh, there is one. Yes, in the middle here.
Hold on. Thank you very much. So Jacques Roosevelt, I'm with TÜVIT. We are running a cyber lab. I have a question to Nick. You changed from your former architecture to a zero trust architecture. What is your requirements to the supply chain from a hardware perspective, from a software perspective, from an organization perspective?
Yeah.
And could you share that to the other operators?
Yeah, that's a great question. In general, our approach for supply chain security is we have to think about the component and kind of where it's going to fit in our overall architecture. That creates ultimately a category of how to think about that product. We have kind of a process for intake that we look at different supply chain intake companies and ultimately evaluate them around a number of different disciplines. And so security is one of those different disciplines. And security takes multiple different forms around those evaluation criteria. So we basically take a set of those criteria, those are listed out, and then kind of go through a process with evaluating that company. Some of those things that also factor into that are past performance as well, right? And so there's different approaches when it comes to their evaluation and answers to questions, things like that, as well as our own measures. We also have a highly capable red team that we're highly thankful for. We use them against ourselves, and then we also use them against products where applicable. And so I think there's a number of different criteria, but we do have to think about the context of where that component is going to fit in an ecosystem. If that's a terminal or if that's something going into a spacecraft, that's a very different thing. We might have to live with one longer than another, or and maybe the last part I'll bring up is you have to start to think about your assurance level. So going back to the lessons of Ukraine, that was a residential grade internet service, right? And so this was being used for military purposes. And so your supply chain evaluation, as an example there, is really important to think about what's the context in which this will fit in. And it's important also to know about your liabilities and the context in which that system will fit in. Because ultimately, you do have to think about economics. You're going to have to think about cost. Something that's up here might cost a lot, and if it's validly a heightened threat environment for that thing, it justifies it. So hopefully that helps with giving a little bit of a framework on how to think about that. And I'm happy to answer more questions with you later, too.
Thank you. There was another question on that side. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, hold on. Here we go.
I don't know if you can answer this, but it seems to be implied by a number of the presentations I've seen today that the future of warfare in space will invariably turn kinetic. And so I wonder, what's the modeling indicate in terms of our current constellation's tolerance to, say, black swan escalation type debris field events? Does that make sense as a question? How quickly could things escalate out of an adversary's modeling? Have we looked at that?
Yes. I don't know if you, from a Space Force perspective.
I would just say yes.
I think, so we published a paper at Amos about debris fields. There's a paper that's out there kind of around, the math around what, debris kind of cascading threats might be. That might be one place to look, but I think in general, different orbits have different dynamics, kind of as we saw. GEO has its own, but I think the main point is that you do have to think about that. And so one of the more interesting realizations I think we've started to conclude is that cyber might be a vector into kinetic as well, right? So you could, kamikaze one spacecraft into another one. So I think now it's getting a little bit more complicated, and so there's a lot of different dynamics that we now have to appreciate of getting close to one another, and and then I think we can determine kind of what the likelihood of that occurring is. But I think there needs to be, to answer your question clearly, there needs to be more modeling at every orbit than I think is currently out there in the public domain. Thank you.
I think we have one last question, and I'm sorry, I'm sending you across the room here.
No more, don't worry. More steps, the better.
Hello, Sasha Toll, my name. Luxembourger, but I work at DLO Responsive Space. And I have a question. Let's suppose we have satellites that can defend themselves in the sense that when they would be under attack, that they could protect their systems by, I don't know, blinding the other satellite or jamming, sending jamming signals and all that, which is solely something, it's a field where there's a lot of testing going and research. But then I ask, who would coordinate such? Who would decide, okay, you can now actively protect you against a threat?
So a question about self-defense satellites. I think it was France that also discussed the possibility of bodyguard satellites for some of their more sensitive military assets. Does anyone want to?
I don't know how to answer this question, but I do agree with you that at some point there must be someone that can orchestrate all these. You're absolutely right. So it's a fair point. We, in NATO, we will continue to operate and proceed like we have done for almost 76 years. In April will be 76 years. So we will reach our agreement, consensus in Brussels. In some cases when our policy does not cover specific cases, then we go back to the council, and on a case-by-case basis, the ambassador will vote and decide. But I agree with you. I mean, someone will have to have the general orchestration of all that. So, sorry if I'm not fully addressing your question, but
it would need to be decided fast because the threat is at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to look at again, this is another complex answer because you have to do analysis on was it intentional, was it not intentional, and then at least for the U.S. is held to the highest levels, and so. There's going to be a whole investigation done before an action is more likely done.
I think also, which is why it's so important that we continue talking about space governance and responsible behaviors in space. We are out of time. Please help me in thanking our fantastic panel, which helped me weather the storm today. So thank you very much.